So hello everyone, I'm Kerry Ball, Deputy Chair of Pracy. For those of you who I haven't met before, I'm here on Dja country in rural Victoria, and I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of country and pay my respects to elders past and present. We've got a large group expected to join us today from across Australia and New Zealand, but I do know it's a public holiday in Victoria, so we might have a few less than we had than have registered, but welcome to you all. Today we're joined by Aisling Ryan, who's presenting her findings from recent research, which examines the use of child-led goal setting. The session will offer you practical tools, strategies, and approaches that involve children in goal setting within clinical practice, aimed at enhancing their engagement and, importantly, their outcomes. Aisling has been working as an occupational therapist with children, young people and their families for the past 15 years. She's practiced in diverse settings in Australia, the UK and Belgium. Aisling's passionate about family-centred, evidence-informed approaches to support children and their families. She spent the last 4 years completing her doctorate at the University of Queensland and teaching and supporting students at UQ and Australian Catholic University. Aisling's PhD research is focused on empowering children to self-advocate in health and disability services through child-led goal-setting practices. She's now working as a lecturer in occupational therapy in the new Masters of OT program at the University of Tasmania. So lucky you to be down in Tasmania, Aisling, and welcome. Before you get going, if I can just ask everyone to make sure that they've got mute on. You'll know that we are recording today's session, so it's available to you and your colleagues across the country. Aisling is going to present to us for the next 45 minutes or so, and we encourage you to use the chat function so that you can talk with each other and also to propose questions that we'll take at the end of the session. So Megan Fox, who's also a director of Pracy, is here to help us with the chat function. So please chat away. We'll be responding to you, and then we'll help Aisling with the questions that we'll open up for the last 10 minutes of the session. So over to you, Aisling. Welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to be here and chat about this topic, which is quite near and dear to my heart, and I think something that's been both a clinical and a research interest for me. I thought rather than repeating the research snapshot that you have covered in Pressy, that I would give you a bit of a journey through the 3 first studies of my PhD, which have all been published, and I am going to link the articles, but really try and focus a bit more on some of the practical takeaways and what I think could be important for clinicians and what really has influenced my practice as an occupational therapist. I just want to acknowledge that this has been really a team effort of research, and my supervisors are listed there on the slide. So I guess just to give you an idea of, why am I interested in child-led goal setting? We know that goal setting is really considered a key component of delivering person-centered allied healthcare. And there's growing recognition that children with disabilities and delays can be involved in goal setting and have the capacity to set realistic and achievable goals. And even more than that, involving children can support their engagement in intervention and have a positive impact on their therapeutic outcomes. However, in practice, intervention really continues to be driven primarily by caregiver and therapist priorities, and child-led practices, which prioritise the active involvement and autonomy of children in goal setting, are underutilized and really not well understood. And I think we can all relate, I definitely can, to that image there on the left, where we're really, when using only perhaps caregiver or our own goals, we're really having to work hard to encourage children to take part in intervention, where perhaps what we're doing is not always well aligned with what they find most important. So I was interested in both examining and advancing child-led goal-setting practices for children who have disabilities and developmental delay. I mentioned to you before that that my thesis has involved sort of a group of studies, and I'm going to focus on the first three and include the links so you can read a little bit more about them if you would like to, because they have been published. But really, I wanted to have a look at what we know about optimal child-led goal setting and evaluation practices from a few different perspectives. So what does the literature say we should be doing? What do experts recommend is best to support children's involvement in goal setting? And then what is actually happening in routine clinical practice? So I'm going to start with the scoping review, which was reviewed by Pressy. This has been published in Developmental Medicine and Child Neurology, and I have included the QR code, but I will also share these slides. So if you don't get a chance to have a quick snap of it now, you will get a chance to later. The aim of this study really was to identify child-led goal setting and evaluation tools and approaches for children who have a disability and delay that are reported in published literature. And because often in the literature, goal setting is described as a joint process between children and caregivers, I really wanted to understand when children can be independently involved in some capacity, what does that look like? So I really focused on when goal setting was completed with child self-respondents, so when they were able to be independently involved in goal setting, independent of their caregiver. You can't really read that diagram on the right, but I just wanted to show you that this scoping review involved reviewing over 12,000 articles, and the results are based on the 50 that we found which met our inclusion criteria. So to support clinical practice, I wanted to understand not just which tools and approaches are used with children or child self-respondents, but how these are actually applied during the goal setting process. So are tools used differently? What actions do they support in child-led goal setting? So through data analysis, I identified 6 overarching goal phases in which tools and approaches were used, and this was synthesized into a new framework which we called DECIDE. So you can see the 6 phases there on the slide, and really these involved unique actions and unique underlying actions for each goal phase. I'm going to go through these in a little bit more detail because some of the further research has really built on these phases, but I'll just show you, give you some examples of how the tools and approaches that we identified were used across this framework. We identified overall 4 child-led tools and 3 child-led approaches that were used with child self-respondents. I'm going to focus a little bit more on the child-led tools, in particular the ones that are in English, because this was an international study. There is also a French tool included in here. So the most common tool that was used with child self-respondents, perhaps unsurprisingly to this group, was the Canadian Occupational Performance Measure. It was used in its full form with children over the age of 8, but actually used with children much younger, so over the age of 4 and above, when it was paired with an additional tool that supported children to elicit goals. So, for example, often a more visual tool that helped children to elicit goal topics. But in general, when we looked at which goal phases the COPM supported with children, it really supports children to elicit goal topics and priorities, and then indicate their baseline performance and evaluate goal progress, as perhaps you're familiar with. The second most common tool used with children was the goal attainment scale. Again, this is probably one that's quite familiar to you. I thought it was interesting that the tool was used primarily with an adolescent. So in some studies, they found that constructing the 5-level scale was a little bit too complex for children, and particularly for children younger than 11. When looking at the DECIDE framework and which phases the GAS supports, it really supports children, or can support children, to construct a goal statement as well as a goal-based outcome measure to indicate baseline performance and evaluate goal progress. And the third child-led goal setting tool that we found in the literature, again, perhaps is a familiar one to some, is the perceived efficacy and goal setting system. So this is a sort of a visual card sort activity where children are presented with two pictures, one of which is a child who's competent at the task, and one of which is a child who has difficulty, and the child identifies which picture they feel is relevant for them. And then of the tasks they find difficult, they pick out their priorities to address as goals. So in the literature, although the PEGS originally was designed to be used for children between the ages of 5 and 9, in the literature or in the studies that we found, it was used with children between the ages of 5 and 12 years, and supports children to both elicit goal topics and priorities and construct a goal statement. I just wanted to highlight some of the supplemental materials that we included with this paper that you might find interesting to in terms of supporting clinical practice. So this was just really a summary of how the tools that were found and which goal phases they supported. But I just wanted to highlight that there were also a number of additional strategies. So these are not, perhaps weren't designed as child-led goal setting tools, but in the literature we can see that professionals are using a wide range of additional tools to support children's involvement in goal setting. And you can see perhaps the largest number of those were in the elicit goal topics and priorities. So I guess what this meant is that for children who needed more support to identify goal topics and priorities, particularly when using a discussion-based tool like the Canadian Occupational Performance Measure, within research, researchers were often pairing a tool like the COPM with an additional tool to help children to identify what might be important to them. And again, you'll see some perhaps familiar tools there, the 8-pack, so participation tools, interest checklists, visuals. There's a wide range of strategies identified, and here I guess a summary of how these were used. I also just wanted to highlight that we included a goal setting and evaluation planning form based on the DECIDE framework, which again, we were hoping this would support clinicians to perhaps consider how they are implementing these goal phases in clinical practice and what tools they are using to support each phase, with the recognition that perhaps you have noticed no single tool covered all goal phases. So this is a whistle-stop tour through the first study, but I just wanted to highlight really that this study helped us to identify that child-led goal setting is a multi-phase process, that there are different actions involved in child-led goal setting that are distinct from each other, that we've used the DECIDE framework to really help clinicians to distinguish between and easily remember these goal phases, so that they can identify appropriate tools that can support children across these goal phases. And it was also interesting to me anyway that children as young as 4 have been or are included in child-led goal setting in the literature. So a pretty broad range of ages. However, the gaps that it really identified for me are that it was interesting that despite our emphasis on multidisciplinary practice, most studies involved goal setting with a single discipline only. And also, apart from age, there really was a lot of variability in the inclusion criteria for studies as to whether children could take part in goal setting. So cognition and communication really were common inclusion or exclusion criteria, but what constituted sufficient cognition or communication really differed. So it didn't really give us a good sense of how do we know children are, or which children can and should take part in child-led goal setting. And also, as I mentioned, although we identified these 6 goal phases, we could see that children's involvement across those goal phases was really inconsistent, and no child-led goal setting tool that was used in these studies covered all goal phases. So often within the research, the researchers were using a combination of tools and additional strategies to support children's involvement. or perhaps in some studies, children's involvement just wasn't very well described. So we really wanted to build on these findings to identify what are the practices within these goal phases that can support children to be involved. And we wanted to consult experts to really identify if there are practices that are being used or recommended to be used in clinical practice that haven't quite been captured in published literature. So the next study involved a Delphi study of optimal child-led goal-setting practices, which has been published in Disability and Rehabilitation. I've just included the QR code there, and all of these articles I'm mentioning are open access. So a Delphi survey, if you haven't come across that before, really aims to address a knowledge gap through a structured iterative process of consensus building using an expert panel. In our study, the expert panel involved 60 allied health professionals from 6 different professional backgrounds and 9 countries. And professionals were considered experts if they had at least 5 years experience in either clinical practice, teaching into a pediatric tertiary program, or conducting research related to goal setting with children. So we really wanted, because we had identified that there was a gap really in the literature related to multidisciplinary goal setting with children, we really wanted to recruit professionals from diverse backgrounds and see what practices we could achieve consensus on within that multidisciplinary group. So we asked, in the first round of this study, we asked the expert panel for their ideas on items related to these 6 factors. So these were open-ended questions. We wanted to know what factors could indicate children are ready to be involved in goal setting, who should be involved in child-led goal setting, what are the process steps that can support children to be involved, what strategies can clinicians use to support children's involvement, and additionally for children with communication or cognitive difficulties, and what frameworks and tools support child-led goal setting, or child-led goal setting frameworks and tools. So across the 3 rounds, following the open-ended question round, the items offered by the experts became a list of items that they then rated their agreement on, and items that achieved over 75% agreement were found to be consensus agreement items, and items that achieved over 75% consensus disagreement were considered disagreement items. And we found after the 3rd round that we didn't really have any additional items, so we really had consensus, achieved sufficient consensus at that point. So I just want to give you really a flavor for what clinicians recommended. There were lots of items recommended by professionals, and particularly in these sections, we had very strong consensus. So in general, our multidisciplinary experts agreed on the process steps and support strategies that can support child-led goal setting. As you can see, almost all of these items reached agreement. And comparatively, we had less consensus in these sections. And I think particularly in relation to the people and roles as to who should be involved in child-led goal setting, this really related to the differing contexts that we work in as professionals, and the fact that really we need to be individualized at times. It was also interesting that a really large number of tools were identified by participants in round 1, but not many of these reached consensus. And perhaps again, that was telling us that the tools that professionals are using are quite discipline or specific, or perhaps geographically specific. So I just want to go into a little bit more detail about these consensus items, because I think this is really, these represent really practical suggestions that build on our scoping review. So in relation to, or really the largest number of items that we had in process steps were related to directing children's attention and engagement to goal setting. So really this is about preparing children for goal setting. And I think To me, this really spoke to the importance of setting up for success in goal setting, and that just asking a child or even a caregiver what their goals are from the get-go perhaps isn't sufficient to really help them to identify meaningful goals. So this is a summary, but some of the items related to scheduling sufficient time, which I know is really difficult for us in time-poor professionals, but there were quite a few items really about giving children enough time and, perhaps needing to space out goal setting over several sessions to make sure that it's meaningful. Building rapport with children and families, and setting up that sort of positive relationship from the start. To explain the purpose, process, and roles in goal setting to the child and the caregiver, and really to help children to identify how much involvement they want to have in goal setting, and tailoring the communication approaches used to the child's abilities and preferences, and really making sure that they understand the process that's being used, and then of course getting to know the child and learning about their preferences, hobbies, and interests. In terms of eliciting goal topics and priorities, the items that reached consensus, or what professionals were recommending, is that it's important to get to know what's important to the child in their everyday life, what they want to do more of, better, or differently, helping them to prioritize goal topics in order of importance. And this last one I think is quite important, which is we know from research that, and perhaps from our clinical experience, that children and caregivers often, we wanted to the next goal phase related to constructing a goal statement. And I think it's important to distinguish between just because we've identified a goal topic, for example, the child wants to learn to ride a bike, there really is an additional step, which is helping to collaboratively construct a statement of some kind that represents the child's desired outcome. So what is it about bike riding that the child wants to be able to do? Is it sufficient that they bike ride in their backyard? Is it that they want to go to the park? Is it with training wheels, without training wheels? So there, I think the DECIDE framework really helped us to distinguish between tools that supported these differing actions. And you can see here the recommendations made by professionals in this section. So it's important to determine what success looks like to the child, help them to break down their goal, particularly if we consider it to be quite a large goal. What's the next step? And use clinical information to help the child refine their goal into a statement that represents their preferred outcome. In terms of indicating baseline performance, that it's important to both discuss current performance and perhaps use some kind of goal-based outcome measure to help the child self-evaluate their goal at baseline. Developing an action plan could involve making sure the goal is linked to the intervention, in identifying who will support goal attainment and what kind of time frame the goal will be reviewed in, and then evaluating involves helping the child to self-evaluate the goal, perhaps by repeating a goal-based outcome measure to help the child to self-identify their progress following intervention. So I also wanted to give you a summary of some of the support strategies that were recommended to help children to be involved in goal setting. Really, this related to 4 categories. So the first was placing the child's perspective centrally. Professionals recommended that we empower children to have a voice and really have an open mind about their preferences and priorities and role in goal setting, which might involve putting aside our therapist agenda and really listening to the child. Other items related to respecting neurodiversity and helping children to build on their strengths. Another key theme within the strategies was that goal setting should be personalized and accessible for children. And really this spoke to me that the process for goal setting for children may need to be different to adults. So it's important that we as professionals are helping to make goal setting individualized and fun for children, using their own communication preferences, to consider using tools like assistive technology, a child-led goal setting tool, concrete goal options to help children to be involved. Oh, I've just lost my next button. Here we go. A third theme was that families should be supported during child-led goal setting. And I think as professionals, we know that we should be using a family-centered approach and really listening to caregivers. And that still rings true when we're supporting children's involvement in goal setting. So some of the items recommended were that we should support caregivers so that they can let their child take an active role in goal setting. And finally, that goals are dynamic and we need to be responsive to child and families' changing needs over time, which might involve adjusting goals in response to children or caregivers' cues, reviewing goals at regular time points, and determining barriers to goals as they come up and assisting children to overcome these. The third item that I wanted to the third factor that I wanted to just give you a bit of a summary of what professionals recommended was about child readiness for goal setting. So I found this quite interesting because the only item to achieve strong consensus in this section was that the child should have interest in an activity or occupation and sort of a desire to choose a goal, so some motivation to take part in goal setting. Other factors that professionals recommended were related to communication and the therapeutic relationship, so that the child should be able to indicate their preference in some way. And really, what they emphasized was that children should be able to communicate in some way, whether that be verbally or non-verbally. So again, highlighting the importance of using the child's own communication approaches, and obviously linking in closely with speech therapists on the team to help children to meaningfully communicate their preferences. And also that children should be able to understand the language used in goal setting. And finally, the other factor that professionals recommended was related to cognition. So rather than what we found in the scoping review was, which was that studies often used IQ as sort of an indication that children should be involved in goal setting. What professionals recommended is that children should be able to understand the process of goal setting in some way, understand concepts like, dislike, or easy and hard, and to be able to follow simple instructions. And again, I think these are all areas that we can support children um, to have these skills by really using tools that support their understanding. So overall from this study, really we built on the findings of our scoping review by adding detail to each phase of the DECIDE framework, outlining the specific strategies and steps that professionals can use to involve children in child-led goal setting. And it was also interesting that rather than age, so no items related to child's age reached consensus, but professionals instead really focused on cognition, communication, motivation, and the therapeutic relationship as factors that can indicate a child is ready to be involved in goal setting, as well as identifying a really large list of strategies that can be used to support children with cognition and communication difficulties to be involved. So we had all of these great recommendations, which were highly practical, but really a next step for me in this research was identifying if and how these practices are being implemented in current practice, and what could we learn from what professionals are doing in routine clinical practice. So that was this third study, which has been published in Disability and Rehabilitation, and the QR code is linked here. So this study was a retrospective analysis of goal-setting practices reported in a community-based allied health service. We were really lucky in this study to partner with Bush Kids, who are a community-based organisation in Queensland that already have very strong goal-setting practices in place that are service-wide, as well as a service, they're strongly underpinned by child and family-centered values. So this really gave us an opportunity to identify how these values were reflected in documented goals. And I guess really how well aligned were the goal-setting practices to the values of this service. So I started out by analysing goal topics that were documented by multidisciplinary professionals in this service, and mapping these to the ICF using ICF linking rules. Um, and you can see there the number of goals that we found in this service in the year that we were looking at. It was really interesting how, despite the, I guess, family-centered nature of this service, when looking at the goals that were documented, the most frequently represented domain was actually body function, which you can see there on the slide. I then wanted to investigate, so go a step further and have a look at how were the child and family-centered practice principles reflected in the documented goals, by applying this goal rating criteria that I developed alongside Bush Kids staff. So Bush Kids has these 4 values. We wanted to look at, or we identified what would be the indicators that these values were met, sort of within what we could tell from documented goals. So we wanted to look at, could we see there was evidence of collaboration with relevant stakeholders, whether that be the child, family, school? Were goals worded in child and family centered language? And was there some indication of the child and family's functional context in the written goal? Was the child included, or was there some indication the child was included in goal setting? And were goals written in child or person first language? And finally, were goal outcomes measured both before and after intervention? So this graph shows those 4 criteria and how they were met within the documented goals. And again, it's quite interesting to see that despite really strong evidence of collaboration with families, the goals were often framed using broad or therapist-specific terms that didn't include the child and family's functional context, which meant we couldn't quite give them the score for the often for family-centered. And just I wanted to show you some examples of how those goals were written. So when they met this family-centered criteria, the goal might say something like support with buttons at home, so language a family could understand, some functional context, as opposed to increase proprioceptive input, so using that more sort of jargon language. Also, we found that there was minimal reported involvement of children, and goals often didn't use person first language. So an example might be when this criteria was met, that the child, so Ashling, to get better at pronouncing her words, as opposed to a goal that was written quite broad in terms such as behavior. So we couldn't really see in these instances whose whose behavior was intended to change as a result of the intervention. So I wanted to just quickly, I guess this is more some of the thought processes that we've had after this study. And we could see that professionals perhaps need a little bit more support to construct goals collaboratively with children and families, which really made us think about, what should goals include? How should we construct goals? Obviously, SMART goals is one method of, or one strategy used for constructing goal statements, which has come up in our research. I guess I just wanted to point to some of the recent studies that are popping up. So this isn't our study, but one that has been published relatively recently, perhaps questioning the validity of SMART goals and how client-centered SMART goals are. So this is an interesting study if you're, I put in the title there if you'd like to have a look. And I guess what it's really saying is that while SMART is a handy acronym to remember, which is perhaps why it's become so prevalent in our practice, that it may not be aligned with the current best evidence, that sometimes the use of SMART goals really encourages us to focus on a very granular level that takes that moves away from what children and families find most meaningful, and really can lead us to have quite a narrow focus. But if we aren't using SMART goals, what else could we be using? I just wanted to put some thoughts here based on both this study, but also some of the subsequent research that we've done, getting the perspectives of children themselves and families, which really indicated that children in particular really want to write goals in their own words using terms that they understand. So as much as possible, something for us to be thinking about is using children and families' own words in goals as much as possible, or at least terms that they understand. That it's important to, we know that embedding our goals in families' everyday life or making it meaningful to their relevant sort of personal context can help goals to be motivating. So it's helpful to include that context in our constructed goal, and also that it's helpful to consider the ICF. And we know from emerging research that participation is really an important domain for children and families, and really considered sort of the ultimate aim of our intervention. And unless we frame goals in using participation language, it's very difficult to then relate it to some sort of participation outcome. So overall, I guess what we took away from this study is that service-wide processes can facilitate consistent goal setting. We did see that this service really had strong evidence of collaborative practice, and I think that really spoke to the expectation they had for all professionals that they have goal setting meetings with families, and that their intervention is really directed at these goals. The service also had a strong practice of using the COPM as a goal evaluation or goal-based outcome measure. So that's really helped the service to collect consistent data about goal achievement. The difficulty was that this Bush Kids wanted to see if the results of this study could help them to identify unmet needs and better direct their services at child and family needs. But it was quite difficult with the way that goals were constructed to be able to identify what the child and family needs were. So really it spoke to the fact that in sort of going forward, it's helpful to collaboratively construct goals with children and families and really document those goals using those the goals that were shared with children and families to better capture what's meaningful. I think I've got 5 minutes to just very quickly whiz through a case study. I'm going to come back to this and show you, I guess, how this has influenced my practice and how I have implemented the DECIDE steps within work I've done with children and families. So I just want to briefly introduce this young man called Adam, who I've obviously changed the details, but this is based on someone that I worked with, who when we began working with Adam, he had a really large number of goals. His mother was quite overwhelmed. She had two children who were both needing additional support. And really they were struggling to have a direction with support for Adam, who had quite a lot of or quite high needs. So as a team, starting with Adam, we decided to take a different approach and have a team meeting where we were setting goals sort of together as a team. Adam is 15. We used the F words tools to get to know him and his family better. So you can see here some of the things he was telling us that were important to him. And because his mum was quite focused on milestones and how he wasn't meeting milestones compared to his peers, using this F words to get to know him and his family really helped us to sort of, I guess, frame our intervention in a different way to his family, and I guess really help them to think about what was important to Adam and them both now and in the future. And really what came out of that discussion is that they want, it was important for them for Adam to be a bit more independent. He has had a diagnosis of autism and an intellectual disability, and really spent most of his time at home, had very limited social interactions, or I guess activities that he participated in general outside of school and his home. But definitely we found that he had interests that we could build on as we got to know him better. We used a visual card sort to elicit goal topics and priorities with Adam. So because he had a communication disability and some difficulty sort of understanding complex language, visuals really helped him to identify what he was interested in, what he found important. And what came out of that discussion was that he wanted to catch the bus. That was his priority. And we then wanted to work out, well, catching the bus, that's a great goal topic, but what would that look like for Adam? What was most meaningful to him? So again, we used some visuals of different places he might go to help him identify where it was that he wanted to catch the bus. His mum was on board, and I should have mentioned, sorry, that we had sort of discussed how we were going to involve Adam in goal setting, and his mum was on board, but she also had her perspective. So Adam wanted to catch the bus to go to South Bank. If you're familiar with Brisbane, that is a lovely spot near the river, which has lots of interesting things that Adam liked, like a Ferris wheel and food places and a garden. But his mum really wanted to for him to take the bus to school independently, and that her motivation was really about making her life a little bit, or her family's life a little bit easier, because they had lots of appointments and 2 children to manage. She thought that would really build his independence as well as make family life easier. So I'll be honest, we thought that was quite a lofty goal, given Adam rarely or never left the house without his mum at that point. So we really wanted to help break down what were the things, the skills that Adam needed to be able to get there, and what were some of the, I guess, next steps that could help him achieve his goal as well as his mother's goal. We used the COPM and particularly an adapted rating scale to help Adam self-evaluate his goal at baseline, and his mum also used the COPM to share her perspective. And unsurprisingly, because Adam had never caught the bus to school, he was rating himself quite low at that point. We then discussed as a team what was the action plan that was going to help Adam to address his goal, and I guess try and make this explicit to his family, how we were linking what we were going to work on to his and their family goal. So we identified that Adam really needed communication skills to be able to greet the bus driver and ask for help, which was, we had a speech therapist involved, so that was great. That Adam needed physical endurance to walk. He was going to have to change buses, so to walk the 600 meters between bus stops and navigate steps onto and off the bus. So that was going to be the role of his physiotherapist with his family, and community access skills to be able to identify bus timetables and also navigate Google Maps, so he knew where he was going to find the bus stop. So I guess why I wanted to include this is to show you, compared to the list of about 12 goals that Adam had for the different professionals before we started working with him as this team. Instead, we could all see that we had a role in addressing this family goal, and that a lot of the skills that were identified in previous goals, like communication or physical endurance, could be addressed when framed in the context of what was meaningful to his Adam and his family. And then in just giving you a quick snapshot of that sort of outcome of this intervention, because Adam and his mum were so motivated to work on this goal, while we spoke about, this might be a goal for the next year, and the next step might be, mum and taking him half the way, and then Adam going the rest of the way. We sort of had it all broken down. Adam actually achieved the goal of taking the bus to school independently, I think, in about a month or two. So he far exceeded my expectations of him. And I really think that, to me, spoke to how him and his mum's energy really became focused on and directed at this goal that was quite important to them. And it really gave Adam, what it meant from there is that Adam started to become much more confident at navigating the community without his family, and identified other places he wanted to go on his own, and really became a bit of an expert at the bus system. So we really saw benefits to his participation outside of this direct intervention. So I didn't think I would get through that. I just want to go back to the key messages from this talk today before I pause for some questions. So overall, I guess what I wanted you to take away is that our research has shown that child-led goal setting is a multi-phase process, and the DECIDE framework hopefully represents a really practical way to strengthen collaborative practice, to could be used to improve consistency across services, but really help professionals to identify how to implement tools and approaches with children to support their involvement. We could also see from the recommendations from professionals and sort of across that research that children are capable of contributing to goal setting when allied health professionals use tailor approaches to their sort of individual needs, and that children really do need child specific approaches and perhaps scaffolding and support to be able to take part. Again, there was a consistent message across the studies that goal setting should use a strengths-based and child-friendly and meaningful language. Sorry, I stumbled on my words there. Rather than sort of therapist-specific or jargon terms. So again, and while I haven't discussed it today, we've sort of gone on to involve children and caregivers in developing a tool with us. And what became really important through that co-design process was using really simple terms that children understood. So they just wanted it to be everyday language that meant something to them. So again, I think kind of speaks to a shift perhaps in how we are going about goal setting in practice. And finally, while this research has involved child-led goal setting, it's really clear that families are also important, and that we're advocating for professionals to use a child and family-centered approach that really acknowledges both perspectives and aims to balance these in the delivery of care. So I think I am just on time and I'm going to stop there and leave some time for questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Aisling. What a fabulous presentation, such interesting research. And I think it's a nice segue for us, thinking about some of the words you've been using, the principles around strength-based, family-centered, child-centered, but you've also been talking about collaboration and accountability and so on. It's been really terrific and very much aligns with the National Best Practice Framework that everyone will be hearing about very soon when it's released. So thank you, that's fabulous. We've had a question from Abraham in Canada. So welcome from Canada. That's great to have you from across the seas join us. Abraham saying, I personally find that discussing and constructing goals with children can be quite challenging. Based on your research, what strategies would you recommend to support engagement and motivation during the goal setting process?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. I hope I'm interpreting it correctly, but I guess from the research and also from my personal practice, I think what's really important is using tools around you and the child to really help children's understanding. So as I've mentioned before, sometimes discussion-based tools like the COPM or just asking a child, what are your goals, is quite difficult. It's quite an abstract concept for children, and I think can make it more difficult for them to understand. And also we know from research that when discussions happen between a child, therapist and caregiver that aren't tailored to children's needs, they often sort of get left out of those conversations. So I guess I've found in the past in my personal practice, which really aligned with the findings, that making it fun, using visuals can really help children to understand. And, where necessary with young children, turning it into a little bit of a game that's about getting to know them. Within our further research, where we've been developing a tool with children and caregivers, what we found when constructing goals that children wanted was a bit of a template. So we used a sort of sentence completion template that helped children to think about the components of a goal. So what did they want to do? Why did they want to do it? And where? So again, sort of thinking about how we can break down goal setting using perhaps simpler concepts and child-friendly language and visuals, I think is a good starting place to help children to be involved. As well as, I think the other key message that came out of this research was about that preparation for goal setting, that sometimes not every child is sort of ready from the get-go. We need to take the time to build rapport and really, I guess, help them to understand what we're asking from them. And sometimes that means not diving straight in the first session, but using that time to get to know each other.
Thank you, Aisling. I hope that answered the question adequately. We've got a hand up from Megan. Would you like to?
Yeah, sorry. Great presentation, thank you. I was just thinking about the challenges and barriers sometimes we have with the time that it takes. Like as you said, you can't jump into it, and relationships are key. I feel as a professional, there's the pressure's on to have the goal, to start working on the goal, and although time wasn't spoken about through presentation there, do you have some understandings, or was there some signs about, what's a good amount of time to spend on goal setting? Or
Yeah, I've been asked this before. I think it's really tricky to sort of give a specific time because I think it's so individual to the child and family and also your service context. I think just what I think the message I would like people to take away is that goal setting in itself is an important part of the therapeutic process and can be therapeutic in itself. And I think from my personal experience, while it may take a bit more time the first time around, I do find that when children and families have had some practice because you've done goal setting with them in a previous block or they've done it with somebody else, it becomes easier for them with those subsequent episodes of goal setting. So I do think that, and I would probably point to some of Iona Novak's work here as well, who obviously has done a lot of work on evidence-based practice. And I guess I know that the message that has come out of that research is that without the child and family's goals at the beginning, then possibly the rest of our intervention is, not as effective anyway. So I think it's really about working out how can we build service structures around those processes that can better support children and families, which of course is difficult, and we have all sorts of pressures as professionals. But the more we advocate, I think, to children and families, but also to the powers that be about, in terms of funding, etc. Hopefully,
I do think
we'll
that
get.
advocacy and collective voice, hopefully to help the policymakers out there to understand. Yeah, thank you.
No worries.
Are there any other questions? Please just put your hand up or camera on. Ashling's got a few more moments before we finish up. Aisling, while we're waiting to see if there's other questions, I'm really interested in implementation. What do you know at this stage about how practitioners are implementing either the DECIDE framework or using the goal setting and evaluation planning form? Do you know anything about that yet?
I think so. The few things I would say about that is in some of the university programs, for example, I know in ACU, it is being taught to students, and so there may be students who hopefully are getting out into practice and starting to use that a little bit more. It's a fairly recent paper, so I think there's probably a bit of variability in how it's being used in practice. But I would say that also in Canada, there's another group that's quite interested in child-led goal setting, who are implementing the Engage approach, so they're doing a big randomized control trial that's a multi-site research study about child-led goal setting. So I think also interested to see what comes out of that research, and hopefully I'll be able to continue. And the next step of my program of research would, of course, be about implementation.
Yeah.
Very interested to hear, though, if anybody, has had a look at it and finds it useful and has had a go implementing in practice. Very keen to be contacted. And
great, thank you. Diana, I can see your camera is on. Do you have a question?
Yes. I've been doing quite a bit of looking into Blank's levels of questions recently, and I've been relating that to what's been talked about today, because my work is with children up to 8 years of age. So being able to, and I'm really interested too in the fundamentals of what kind of skills could I be empowering children with, even if they're not yet ready to be able to start making goals. But when you were describing before sentence finishing with making goals of what, why, where, that would be at Blank's level of 3. And I'm thinking evaluating goals would be at blank level 4, which for a typically developing child, that's somewhere around about 5, 6 years of age. But of course, not all children are going to be at that level. So thinking about how we can be supporting children who are not yet there is something that I'd like you to give me some thoughts about. And also my other question is the visuals that you showed earlier that some people, or there was a particular program or something, where did that come from?
So to answer your first point, thank you, Dana. I think those are really interesting and relevant thoughts. And I think again, to sort of speak to the next step of our research, which I haven't quite covered today, but I've mentioned, where we've been looking at co-designing a tool with children and families. What came out of that research is that, we had children involved in that study who had never had any experience with choice making before, ever, and perhaps were older, at an age where they were starting to transition, where they were being asked questions about where they wanted to live after school, and but really the feedback we were having, or what parents and the children themselves were telling us, is that it was quite difficult to do goal setting when you had no practice, when you hadn't had any practice with choice making. And so some of the recommendations from participants in that study was that some children may need the components of goal setting broken down and to practice, for example, talking about likes and dislikes, making simple choices sort of about what they want to do in their everyday life before they start, I guess, adding that together to a more abstract or complex process like goal setting. So I think what I would say is that we don't need to wait for children to be ready so much as our role can be about building those skills that are going to then help them to be meaningfully involved in goal setting in the future. And that can start when they're quite young, really, when we're thinking about teaching concepts like you've mentioned. So hopefully that sort of answers your questions. I think children with disabilities become adults with disabilities, and we know that in the NDIS they're expected to have choice and control, but if they have no experience like you've mentioned, or I guess skills at self-determination, it becomes quite difficult. So hopefully that answers your first part, I think, and maybe those blank level questions are a helpful resource to share to the group to be thinking about how to structure prompts for children. The visual that you've mentioned, I'm not 100% sure which one you meant, but I will share the slides, and if it's unclear where something has come from, perhaps send me an email and I'm happy to share the reference if it's not included.
Thank you so much, Aisling. That's really helpful and a nice way for us to finish up, that you'll be sharing the presentation, and also the recording will be available for people. There's also a research snapshot, as you mentioned earlier, that Pracey's done. Kerry Dominish, one of our colleagues on the Pracey board, has pulled together that presentation, so you can find that on the website. And as you said, all of your articles are open access, so they're available for people to have a look at. So thank you. It's been a really informative session, and I think a very timely one for us all. So thank you all. Please, everyone, help me thank Aisling, and thank you all for joining us. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.